Chapter 69. Denner's Ledger. Denner Holt had spent the 6 weeks since his records room burned doing something nobody had explicitly asked him to do, and something he'd told almost no one about. Quietly, methodically, reconstructing every document he could remember from memory, cross-referencing his own recollection against whatever surviving copies existed elsewhere in the district, filling notebook after notebook in careful, patient handwriting that Wren, encountering it for the first time, immediately recognized as a kindred obsession. "You've rebuilt almost the entire requisition history," she said, flipping through his latest notebook with open astonishment. The two of them working late at the outpost one evening while Cale drilled formations outside. Denner, this is genuinely impressive work. Why didn't you tell anyone you were doing this?" Denner scratched the back of his neck, looking faintly embarrassed. "Didn't seem like much, next to everything the rest of you have been doing. Fighting beasts, reading secrets out of old paper, facing down conspiracies. I just fill out forms. You filled out an entire records room from memory. That's not nothing, that's—" Wren searched for the word. "That's a kind of magic all on its own. Honestly, even without a class attached to it, wasn't magic. Just didn't want to let them win by erasing something twice." Denner's voice went quieter, more serious than his usual mild manner allowed. "I've been posted at this outpost 11 years. Long enough to remember Dre, actually. Not well. I was junior staff back then. Barely more than a runner. But I remember him being sharp, ambitious, the kind of officer who made you feel like the guild was heading somewhere important under his watch." He shook his head slowly, finding out what he actually did, what he let happen to protect his own career. "That sat with me worse than I expected. I keep thinking about all the small, ordinary decisions I've made in this job over the years, trusting that the people above me were making the hard calls for good reasons. Makes you wonder how many other Dre's are sitting quietly in offices somewhere, deciding what the rest of us don't get to know." Cale, arriving in time to catch the tail end of it, sat down across from him with genuine respect he hadn't fully articulated before. "You didn't have to do any of this," he said. "The records room burning wasn't your fault. Nobody would have blamed you for just filing an incident report and moving on. Maybe not, but I've spent a lot of my career being the person who fills out the paperwork nobody else wants to bother with. And I've always told myself that mattered, even when it felt small." Denner met his eyes, steady despite the visible discomfort of saying it out loud. "This is the first time the paperwork actually turned out to matter as much as I always hoped it did. I wasn't going to let a fire take that away without a fight, even a quiet one." "Operator," Ashen said softly, once Denner had gone back to his notebooks and Wren had returned to her own careful cross-referencing. "I would like to note, for the record, that this district's strength has never rested solely on you or on any single dramatic capability. It rests on people like this. Steady, plain, genuinely decent, doing the necessary work without needing recognition for it. You're building towards something. I am simply observing that whatever the undersigned believe about power, they appear to fundamentally misunderstand where it actually comes from. I find that, cautiously, encouraging." Cale looked across the room at Denner, hunched over his careful reconstruction of a records room some faceless organization had tried to erase, and felt something warm and certain settle in alongside everything else he'd learned to carry. "Yeah," he agreed quietly. "Me too." Chapter 70. Letters from the Capital. Ilyana's contingent departed 2 days after the trial's closing feast, and within a week, letters had started arriving with a regularity that made Cale's evenings feel, for the first time in a while, like they belonged to more than just Ashenreach. Corvina wrote plainly, as always, about ordinary things mixed in with careful updates. Ophelia's garden doing poorly this season, a cousin's wedding Cale had never heard of, and, tucked into the third paragraph, with the same careful weight she'd used for the original missing persons letter. News that the capital's own historical archives had, at Merrow's request, begun a discreet review of any records referencing the undersigned or unusual departmental seals matching the one Marsh had preserved. Nothing conclusive yet, she wrote, but nothing this quiet stays buried forever. Not once enough people start actually looking. I have faith in that, if in little else about how this began. Ophelia's letters were shorter, warmer, mostly full of small domestic details that Cale suspected were deliberately chosen to remind him the world still had ordinary corners left in it. A new stray cat that had adopted the garden, a recipe she wanted to try sending him once she found a courier willing to carry preserved ingredients that far. I do not need updates on conspiracies, she wrote once, plainly. I need to know you are eating properly and sleeping enough. Please lie to me convincingly if the answer is no. Ilyana's letter, when it finally arrived a week after her departure, was considerably more direct. Rennick, Aunt Petra's been quietly reassigning talent division staff for 2 weeks now, cross-checking everyone with any historical connection to Dre's old resource allocation office. She won't say much about it directly, but I've overheard enough to know she's taking this much more seriously than the official channels suggest. Also, Dre requested an unusual leave of absence 3 days ago. Family matters. Officially. Nobody's been able to confirm he actually has family to visit. Thought you'd want to know before it reaches you through slower channels. IK. P.S. Tell the chronicler her locked mechanism solution is still being discussed in Academy Tactics lectures. Apparently, aggressive reading comprehension is now an official case study. Cale read that last letter twice, feeling the careful calm of the past 2 weeks crack slightly at the edges. Dre's running, he said, showing it to Ren and Seraphine that evening, gathered at the scrapyard workbench the way they'd gathered so many times now that it had stopped feeling like anything unusual at all. Or getting ready to. That's not a coincidence, is it? No, Seraphine said, grim. I think it means whoever's above him has decided he's become a liability, which either means they're protecting themselves by cutting him loose, or they're protecting him somewhere we can't reach, Ren finished. Either way, that's not good news. I would agree with that assessment, Ashen said quietly. Operator, I believe the quiet, patient phase of this investigation may be drawing toward its end. Whether we are fully ready for that or not, Cale folded Ilyana's letter carefully, the same way he'd once folded his mother's, and looked out toward the dark, quiet shape of the Ashwood Deep on the horizon. Patient, unhurried, exactly as it always had been, holding whatever secrets it still had left with the same stubborn silence it had kept for 2 centuries. Then I guess we'd better be ready anyway, he said. He read Ilyana's letter one more time before bed, and it was the postscript under the postscript. 3 words she'd scrawled and half scratched out, as if she'd thought better of sending them and then sent them anyway, that kept him awake long after the lamp burned down. Watch your backs. Chapter 71. A Quiet Threat. Merrow's confirmation arrived 4 days later, delivered in person rather than by letter, his lined face carrying the particular grimness Cale had learned to associate with news that hadn't gotten there through official channels at all. Dre's gone, he said, without preamble, gathering Cale, Holden, and Ren into the outpost's back room. Not on leave. Gone. His capital residence was empty when Guild security finally checked it 2 days ago. No forwarding address, no trace of where he went. Whoever's protecting him moved him somewhere we can't currently follow. And they did it quietly enough that we lost nearly a week before anyone noticed the pattern. So the person who denied my mother's oversight request, the one piece of this we could have formally prosecuted, Cale started, is currently untouchable, Merrow finished, grim. Yes, I won't pretend that isn't a real loss. But I want to be clear about something else, too. This tells us they're worried. You don't spend resources hiding a 15-year-old cover-up's most exposed piece unless you believe the investigation is genuinely closing in. He looked around the room, which means we should expect them to get more careful, or more desperate, or both, in the weeks ahead. Ren, notebook already open, was already working through the implications with her usual careful precision. If they're worried enough to relocate Dre, they might also be worried enough to move against anyone who could still testify against him directly. Marsh. Us. She looked up sharply. Kale. We need to warn Marsh again. Properly this time, with actual protection, not just a friendly letter. Already arranged, Marrow said. Guild escort left for his cottage this morning, offering formal relocation to somewhere far safer, with his full consent. I'm not leaving another loose thread exposed if I can help it. It was, in the end, a quiet week that followed. No further fires, no further shadowy visitors at the scrapyard gate. Nothing dramatic enough to justify the tight, coiled tension that had settled over the whole investigative team regardless. Kale found the quiet almost harder to sit with than open danger would have been. The way waiting for a blow was often worse than the blow itself. You're not sleeping, Seraphine observed one evening, finding him at the workbench well past midnight, hands busy with a construct he wasn't actually paying attention to. I keep thinking about what happens next, whether next means something arrives or whether it means more waiting, and I genuinely don't know which one I'm more afraid of. Seraphine settled beside him, quiet for a long moment before she spoke. My father used to say something, when I was younger and impatient about slow political matters I didn't understand yet, that the difference between anxiety and readiness is mostly a matter of what you do with the waiting. She nudged his shoulder gently. You've spent 5 months turning waiting into training, into investigation, into an actual district full of people who trust you. That's not nothing, Kale, even when it doesn't feel like enough. She is correct, operator. And I would add, Tier 4 readiness is closer than I initially estimated. Whatever comes next, you will not be facing it as the boy who once sputtered a dim brown-gray light on an awakening platform. I believe that distinction matters much more than you currently allow yourself to feel. Kale set his tools down, finally, and let himself simply sit with Seraphine in the quiet dark of the scrapyard, the unfinished construct forgotten between them, and found that, even with the waiting, even with everything still unresolved, he could, for tonight at least, let the fear rest instead of carrying it alone. Chapter 72. Tier 4. It came, in the end, on an entirely ordinary morning. No crisis, no beast attack, no dramatic revelation. Just Kale running the same swarm formation drill he'd run 100 times before, adjusting for a subtle inefficiency Ren's careful notes had flagged the week prior, when the familiar shift in his own ether finally settled into something new. System notification. Threshold reached. Sustained efficiency growth. Structural application data. Cooperative combat integration confirmed. Drone sovereign. Tier 3. Tier 4. New aptitude unlocked. Distributed command. Construct coordination range. And independent decision-making capacity significantly expanded. Individual constructs may now execute complex multi-step objectives with reduced direct oversight. Note: this represents the practical threshold historically associated with genuine containment scale operation. You are not there yet, but you are, for the first time, capable of beginning to understand what there would actually require. Kale read it twice, standing in the crisp morning air of the scrapyard's backlot, 31 constructs holding formation around him, without needing a single active thought to maintain their positions, and felt the shape of 5 months' patient, unglamorous work finally, quietly, arrive somewhere that mattered. Ashen. Distributed command. What does that actually mean in practice? It means, operator, that you are no longer required to consciously direct every construct's every action. You may set broader objectives. Hold this line, protect this position, search this area, and trust the swarm to execute them intelligently, adapting to circumstances you have not personally anticipated. This is, historically, The foundation every recorded warlord's containment strategy was built upon. Not perfect control, trusted delegation at scale. Ren, arriving in time to catch the tail end of the notification, went very still, reading his expression correctly before he'd said a word. That's the big one, isn't it? The one you've been working toward since the trial. Tier 4, Kale confirmed. Something settling into his chest that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite relief, but sat comfortably somewhere between the two. Ashen says it's the beginning of actually understanding what containment scale operation would even look like. He nodded at the formation's far corner, where Old Scuttle had appointed itself squad leader of 6 much newer constructs without being assigned anything. Also, apparently, it means that one gets opinions about the others now. Ashen thinks whatever stabilized its binding is the same thing distributed command is built on. It's been doing Tier 4 by itself for months. We just didn't have a name for it. So, not there yet. But closer, closer, Kale agreed. He looked out at his own formation. 31 small, patiently constructed machines holding steady without him needing to think about a single one of them individually. And found himself thinking, unexpectedly, not of the deep root or the undersigned, or any of the vast, looming weight of everything still ahead, but of a broken clock tower, 6 years unfixed, and a boy who'd once believed that patient, careful attention to small things was the only kind of magic he'd ever be allowed to have. 5 months ago, I could barely hold 3 constructs steady at once, he said, mostly to himself. Now I've got 31, holding a perfect formation while I stand here talking to you, instead of concentrating. Growth, Ren said, echoing Ashen's own favorite word with a small, fond smile. Actual, real growth. The kind that doesn't happen because a system handed it to you for free. The kind you actually built, one badly named machine at a time. Kale looked at his own hands, soot-stained, scarred, far surer than they'd been on that first humiliating Awakening Day platform, and felt, for the first time in a long while, something that wasn't fear or dread of what still waited out past the tree line. He felt ready, not finished, not fully prepared for whatever the undersigned, or Dre, or the deep root itself still had waiting for him, but ready enough, finally, to stop simply reacting to whatever came next, and start, instead, deciding what to do about it. All right, he said, dismissing the formation with a thought, and watching 31 constructs settle gently back into inert scrap around him, patient as ever. Let's go find out what Tier 4 actually looks like against something that isn't a training drill. Chapter 73. The Auditor. He got his answer faster than he expected, and considerably faster than he wanted. It came 8 days after Tier 4, in the form of a guild courier riding hard into Ashenreach at dusk, with a message that had Halden's face going gray before she'd even finished reading it aloud. Marsh's relocation convoy was attacked, she said. 2 days out from his old cottage. Guild escort held, nobody killed. But whoever came at them wasn't subtle about it this time. Description matches nothing in our registry. Combat capability well above what a simple hired thug should have. And gone before reinforcements arrived. She looked up, Marrow's calling it confirmation. The undersigned aren't just protecting secrets quietly anymore. They're willing to risk open combat to keep this contained. Operator. If they have escalated to direct combat operatives, our own security posture needs to escalate accordingly. I would recommend increased vigilance immediately, not after the next incident. The next incident came 3 nights later, and it came for Ren. She was walking back from the outpost's records room, later than she should have been. Notebook full of the day's careful cross-referencing work, when a figure detached itself from the shadow of the chapel wall, with a stillness that made every hair on her arms stand up before he'd said a single word. Miss Cabot, the man said, unhurried. And Ren knew the voice before she placed the face, because Kale had described both, carefully, after the scrapyard gate. The Auditor, except the pleasant messenger's ease was gone, replaced by a coiled, combat-ready stillness that hadn't been there before. I'd like a moment of your considerable talent, if you'll give it willingly. I'd rather not take it any other way. Ren, heart hammering, did the one thing 3 months of chronicler training had drilled into her without her ever consciously deciding to practice it. She screamed, loud and sharp, directly toward the outpost's protective perimeter, and simultaneously bolted for the nearest lit doorway, with a speed that surprised even her. The auditor moved to intercept, fast, faster than Ren could possibly outrun, and ran directly into a wall of packed scrap and aether that hadn't existed a half-second earlier, thrown up by a construct Cale had, at Ashen's quiet insistence, kept stationed near the chapel every night since the Marsh convoy attack. System notification. Passive distributed command. Sentinel construct engaged threat autonomously. Tier 4 command range confirmed functional, without direct operator oversight. Cale arrived at a dead sprint, less than a minute later, Bryce right behind him, to find the Auditor already retreating into the dark beyond the Sentinel's reach. Wounded, but not seriously. Ren shaking, but entirely unharmed behind the outpost's threshold. "You're getting braver," Cale called after the retreating shape, breathing hard, more furious than he'd felt in months. Or more desperate. "I genuinely can't tell which anymore." The Auditor paused at the tree line, just long enough to be heard clearly across the distance. "Desperate men send messages," he said. "I came to deliver one. Your chronicler reads things that were never meant to surface again. My associates would very much like her to stop, before someone decides a wall of scrap metal isn't a permanent solution." He was gone before anyone could reach him, and Ren, wrapped in Seraphine's arms moments later, shaking with adrenaline rather than fear, managed, through it all, a single defiant, badly timed laugh. "Tell your associates," she called into the dark tree line, voice only slightly unsteady, "that I've read worse handwriting than theirs and survived it." "Bravado," Ashen observed quietly, once the immediate danger had passed. "Necessary, in the moment. But operator, this changes the calculation significantly. They know precisely how to hurt you now. Through the people around you, not through you directly." Cale looked at Ren, pale but defiant, and felt something cold and absolutely resolved settle into his chest. "Then we make sure that never works," he said. "Whatever it takes." Chapter 74. Closer Watch. Marrow's response to the Auditor's threat was immediate and, for the first time since the investigation began, entirely without the careful, patient restraint that had defined every prior step. "No more quiet phases," he said, gathering the full protective detail at the outpost the next morning. Exhaustion and fury both visible in his weathered face. "They've moved from bureaucratic erasure to direct combat operatives targeting civilians. That's not a line I'm willing to let them redraw twice." He looked around the room. Cale, Ren, Bryce, Seraphine, Halden, Denner, Tamsin, Joran, all present, all grim. "Effective today. Nobody connected to this investigation moves without escort. That includes chapel visits, market trips, training drills. I know it's not comfortable. I don't especially care." Ren, still pale from the previous night but stubbornly present at the table anyway, didn't argue, which told Cale more about how shaken she actually was than anything she might have said. "I want to keep working," she said instead. "The Auditor threatened me specifically because I'm effective. I'm not going to stop being effective because he's scared of what I might find next." "Nobody's asking you to stop," Marrow said. "I'm asking you to stop doing it alone, unescorted, after dark." There's a considerable difference. The days that followed took on a harder edge than the careful, patient rhythm of the previous months. Guild escorts, now a constant, quiet presence at every corner of ordinary life. Cale's own Sentinel constructs expanded to a permanent perimeter around the scrapyard, the chapel, and the outpost alike, humming steady and watchful through every night. "Feels strange," Bryce admitted one morning, watching a trio of Kale's constructs patrol the market square's edge with the same unhurried vigilance a proper hunter detail would carry. Half this town still doesn't fully understand what's actually happening. They just see a guild task force and some new machines and assume it's about the deep-root business everyone's already half forgotten from the trial season. Probably better that way, Kale said. Less panic if they don't know how close it's actually gotten. Maybe. Still feels like lying by omission. Bryce reset his stance, spear ready for the morning's drill. You planning to tell them eventually? The whole town, not just the people already in the middle of it? Kale considered that, turning it over the way he turned over everything difficult. Eventually, he said. Once there's something they can actually do about it besides be afraid. Right now, telling them would just be handing them a weight to carry, with nothing to put down alongside it. That's not kindness. That's just spreading the fear around. A mature distinction, operator. I would only add, that calculation may not hold indefinitely. If the deep roots cycle accelerates as far as I suspect it eventually will, this town will need to understand what it's facing well before the danger arrives at their doorstep. Timing that disclosure correctly will matter a great deal. I know. I'm working on it. I did not doubt that you were. I simply wanted it said aloud, so that neither of us mistakes comfortable silence for a plan. Kale nodded, filing the thought away alongside everything else he was quietly, patiently building toward, and turned back to the morning's drill. Bryce's spear already resetting, Wren's window lamp already burning with another night's careful work. The whole fragile, extraordinary machinery of a district, slowly, deliberately learning how to defend itself against something most of its own people didn't yet know existed. Chapter 75. What the Sentinels Caught. The Auditor came back 11 days later, and this time, Ashen's expanded perimeter caught him before he ever reached the town proper at all. System notification. Perimeter breach detected. Northern boundary. 0300 hours. Threat signature matches prior encounter. The Auditor. Sentinel network has engaged autonomously per standing distributed command directive. Kale was out of bed and moving before he'd fully processed the notification. Bryce and a guild escort close behind, sprinting through the dark toward the northern tree line, were three of his Sentinel constructs. Patient, tireless, exactly as capable as Tier 4's promise had suggested, had already pinned the Auditor in a tightening containment net of packed scrap and ether-locked wire. He was good. Kale could see that immediately. Even in the dark, even mid-fight, the Auditor moved like someone who'd trained his whole life for exactly this kind of close, brutal engagement, cutting through two of the three Sentinels with brutal efficiency before the third finally wrapped a locking cable around his sword arm and held. Careful, Kale called, arriving at the edge of the clearing, Bryce's spear already leveled. We want him alive. Talking, ideally. That was already my plan, the Auditor said, breathing hard, still fighting the Sentinel's grip with grim, controlled effort. Wasn't expecting your little machines to actually hold this well against me. Tier 4, is it? Faster progress than my associates predicted. Your associates predicted my progress? My associates have been studying machinist evolution patterns for 200 years, Rennick. You're not the mystery to us that you apparently are to yourself. The Auditor's arm finally tore free of the Sentinel's grip with a wrench of raw strength. But Kale was already moving, dropping low and throwing everything he had into a full containment dome. The same structural application he'd refined at the trial, scaled up, denser, holding this time with a solidity his earlier attempts had never quite managed. Tier 4 stability confirmed under live combat pressure. Aether cost remains high, but sustainable for. How long can I hold him? Kale cut in. At current reserve, perhaps 4 minutes before backlash risk becomes significant. 4 minutes, Kale said, aloud, to the Auditor now fully contained within the dome's curved walls. That's how long you've got to decide whether you'd rather talk to me or talk to Adjudicator Marrow once he arrives with far less patience than I've currently got left. The auditor studied him through the dome's shifting scrap metal walls, something almost like genuine respect breaking through the professional coldness. "You've got your mother's stubbornness," he said. "I read her research notes once, a long time ago, before they were quietly filed away where nobody would find them again. She wouldn't let go of a thread either, once she'd started pulling it. You knew her. I knew of her. Different thing." The dome held, groaning slightly under the strain, as Marrow's guild escort finally arrived at a run behind them. "I'll tell your adjudicator what my position allows me to tell him. Not everything. I'm not suicidal, but enough to prove my associates aren't the only ones capable of a gesture of good faith." He met Kale's eyes directly through the dome's shifting wall. "For what it's worth, Rennick, some of us never agreed with what happened to your parents. That doesn't undo it, but it's true. And I thought you should hear it from someone who was actually there, 15 years ago, watching it happen and doing nothing to stop it." Kale, dome still holding, aether draining fast, felt something complicated and unresolved twist through the cold certainty he'd carried for months. "That's not forgiveness," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for it," the auditor said. "I'm just done pretending it didn't cost me something too." Chapter 76. What the auditor knew. Marrow's questioning of the captured auditor took most of the following day, conducted carefully, formally, with Halden and 2 senior guild officers present, and Kale specifically kept at a distance. "Not because I doubt your judgment," Marrow told him plainly, "but because a prisoner's more likely to speak freely to people he doesn't have a personal history with." What emerged, delivered secondhand through Marrow that evening, changed the shape of everything Kale thought he understood about the scale of what was coming. "He won't name names above his own operational tier," Marrow said, gathering the same small, trusted circle at the outpost. "Understandable. Whoever runs the undersigned clearly compartmentalizes ruthlessly enough that even their own operatives can't expose the top of the structure. But he confirmed several things we suspected, and one thing we didn't." He paused, weighing how to deliver it. "The second deep root site Wren identified in the old archive fragments, the one west of the mountains, is active. Not dormant, active, and accelerating, on a timeline the undersigned themselves are apparently struggling to control." "Struggling to control," Seraphine repeated slowly. "Meaning they're not just hiding this. They're trying to manage it directly." "That appears to be the case." His account suggests the undersigned's original founding purpose, 2 centuries ago, wasn't simply secrecy for its own sake. It was an attempt to manage deep root cycles quietly, through controlled guild influence, rather than risk the kind of large-scale coordinated response your class was originally built for. Whether that started as genuine caution or something much more self-interested, I can't yet say. But 200 years of quiet management appears to be failing now, on both sites simultaneously, and I don't think that's coincidence. "Operator, if I may," Ashen said quietly, "I would suggest an alternative reading. If machinists were deliberately suppressed specifically because they represented the intended coordinated response, then 2 centuries without any machinist at all may be precisely why quiet management has begun failing." The undersigned removed the solution and kept managing the symptom. Eventually, symptoms alone stopped being manageable. Marrow considered that for a long moment, something grim settling into his face. "If that's accurate, it means the entire crisis both sites are now approaching may be, in part, a direct consequence of removing your class from the equation in the first place." Kale sat with the weight of that. 2 centuries of fear-driven caution, quietly compounding into exactly the disaster it had been meant to prevent, and felt something clarify in his chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with resolve. "Then the answer isn't more hiding," he said. "It's the opposite. It's exactly what they were always afraid of. A real, coordinated public response, before both sites reach whatever the accelerated timeline actually means. That's not a small ask, Master Rennick, Marrow said. That means convincing the Guild Council, possibly the Crown itself, that an ancient, half-forgotten threat is real, urgent, and requires resources on a scale this kingdom hasn't mobilized in living memory. Based on the testimony of a captured enemy operative and the word of a 15-year-old whose class didn't officially exist 8 months ago. I know it's not small, Kale said. I'm not asking you to make it small. I'm asking whether you think it's true. Marrow held his gaze for a long moment, weathered and tired, and, underneath it, entirely certain. I think it's true, he said, which means I suppose we'd better find out how to convince far more skeptical people of the same thing, before the timeline runs out on its own. Chapter 77. Before the Storm. Marrow left for the capital 3 days later, carrying the auditor's testimony and a formal request for Guild Council audience personally prepared with Halden's help, and the district settled, in his absence, into a strange, suspended kind of calm. Not peace exactly, but a held breath before whatever came next. And Kale found himself, for the first time in weeks, with an evening that genuinely belonged to nothing but himself. He spent it, predictably, at the scrapyard, and was not remotely surprised when Seraphine found him there. You've got that look again, she said, settling beside him on the back step. The one where you're carrying next month's entire crisis in your shoulders, 3 weeks early. Occupational hazard. Put it down for one evening. I mean it. She bumped his shoulder, gentle but insistent. Whatever's coming, it isn't coming tonight. Tonight there's just us, and a scrapyard, and a workbench full of badly named machines who don't actually need supervision right now. Kale let himself, slowly, actually do it. Set the weight down, just for an evening, and found that with Seraphine beside him, it wasn't nearly as hard as he'd expected. Can I ask you something, he said, after a while. That has nothing to do with the undersigned, or the deep root, or any of it, always. When this is over, whatever over ends up meaning, what do you actually want? Not what your family expects, not what the district needs from you, just you. Seraphine was quiet for a long moment, considering it with the same careful honesty she brought to everything. I used to think I wanted to matter, she said finally. To be more than a governor's daughter waiting for an arranged marriage to a family that would look good on a map. I thought that meant proving myself in combat, or politics, or something loud enough that nobody could dismiss me. She glanced at him, something unguarded in her expression. I don't think that anymore. I think I want exactly this. Ordinary evenings that get to just be ordinary sometimes. People who see me clearly, instead of seeing what my family name is worth. I found that here, in a scrapyard, with an F-rank inventor everyone else in this town had already written off. A small, private smile. Turns out that was worth considerably more than I expected. Kale, throat tight, found he didn't have anything clever to say to that at all, so he didn't try. And they sat together in the quiet dark for a long while, saying nothing further, because for once, nothing further needed saying. Wren found them there an hour later, predictably, and announced her arrival from 20 feet away, the way she always did when she suspected a serious conversation she intended to lighten. Bryce and I made dinner, she announced. Well, Bryce made dinner. I supervised and occasionally suggested improvements he ignored. It's better than it sounds. Come eat before it gets cold. They did. All 4 of them crowded around Fenn's workbench with plates balanced on their knees. Fenn himself grumbling good-naturedly about scrap getting food on it, and for one full evening, the weight of an ancient world-ending entity and a 2-century conspiracy simply, deliberately, wasn't allowed in the room. A good evening, operator, Ashen said quietly, once the others had finally gone home, and Kale sat alone in the settling dark, full and warm and for once, entirely at peace. I want that noted again. I suspect, before this is over, you are going to need every single one of these to hold on to. I'm holding on to this one already, Cale said, and meant it completely. Chapter 78. The Council's Doubt. Marrow's letters from the capital, over the following 2 weeks, told a story of exactly the resistance he'd predicted. Careful, frustrating, entirely understandable from the outside, and maddening from within. The Council believes the threat is real, he wrote, but real and urgent enough to justify unprecedented resource mobilization are two very different thresholds to clear. Half the Council remembers this kingdom's last major crisis response, 40 years ago, and remembers how badly premature mobilization damaged public trust when the threat proved smaller than feared. They are not wrong to be cautious. They are, however, working from information 2 centuries out of date, and I am having considerable difficulty convincing them my own information is more current. Holden, reading the letter aloud at the outpost, set it down with visible frustration. He's fighting institutional memory, she said. The guild's slow to move on anything this size, precisely because moving fast has burned them before. That's not corruption. That's just bureaucracy being exactly as cautious as it's designed to be, at exactly the wrong moment. So what happens if they don't move fast enough? Bryce asked. Then we handle what we can with what we've got, Cale said. The same way we've handled everything so far. He looked around the room. Wren's notebook, Denner's careful reconstruction, Tamsin's field expertise, Bryce's steadily growing skill, Seraphine's quiet, certain presence, and felt something settle into clarity he hadn't expected to find this early. We've never actually been waiting on the Guild Council to save us. We've been building something ourselves, one careful piece at a time, since before any of them even believed the threat was real. A fair assessment, Operator. Though I would caution, building a district-level response is one matter. What the historical fragments describe as a proper awakening event containment effort requires resources significantly beyond what a single district, however well prepared, can provide alone. I know. I'm not saying we don't need the council eventually. I'm saying we can't just sit here hoping they hurry up. Cale turned to Wren. How's the second site research coming? Slowly. Old records. Worse condition than the ones here. Wren flipped through her notebook, frowning. But I found something interesting yesterday. A cross-reference. The family that's governed that western district for the last 2 centuries. Same pattern as House Alcarn here. Old, quiet, hereditary stewardship nobody currently in the family fully remembers the original purpose of. Seraphine sat up sharply. You're saying there's another Seraphine out there? Another family sitting on top of a deep root site without knowing why their ancestors were really put in charge of it? Maybe. I'd like to find out. Wren looked at Cale, something determined settling into her expression. If the council's too slow, maybe we don't wait for them to authorize contact. Maybe we reach out to that district directly, ourselves, the same way you reached out to your own family once the truth finally caught up to you. Cale considered it, turning the idea over carefully, and found, to his own surprise, that it felt less like recklessness and more like exactly the kind of quiet, patient, unglamorous work that had gotten them this far already. Draft the letter, he said. Let's find out if we're the only district willing to actually look this problem in the eye. Chapter 79. Faster than the record suggested. The reply from the Western District came back far faster than Cale expected, and much more frightened than he'd hoped. A young Lord Howrick Venmore, inheriting his own family's quiet stewardship only the previous year, writing back within days of receiving Wren's careful, evidence-backed letter. I confess I do not fully understand what you are describing, he wrote. But I have spent the last 6 months watching my own district's forest boundary do things my grandfather's records insist it has never done before, and receiving no useful answers from guild channels when I ask why. If even half of what you describe is accurate, I would very much like to speak with you directly, and soon. 6 months, Tamsin said. reading over Kale's shoulder with a grim frown. Same rough timeline as our own boundary migration started. That's not coincidence. That's synchronization. I would agree, Ashen confirmed, and I would add, if both sites are accelerating on a shared timeline, my earlier estimate of years, possibly less, requires urgent revision. I believe we should now assume less is the more likely outcome and plan accordingly. The news landed hard, and it landed at the worst possible moment. The same week Marrow's letters from the capital reported, with visible frustration, that the council had approved only a modest increase in district resources, far short of the coordinated response he'd requested, still unwilling to commit fully without more concrete proof. "They want proof," Kale said, reading Marrow's letter aloud to the small, exhausted circle gathered at the outpost that evening. "We've got a captured operative's testimony, 2 synchronized boundary migrations, a 200-year-old suppressed archive, and an actual machinist standing in front of them. What more proof do they need? A crisis they can't ignore," Halden said, quiet and grim. I hate saying it that plainly, but that's how institutions this size tend to move historically. Not on warnings, on disasters they can no longer pretend aren't happening. She looked around the room. I don't want that to be true. I don't think any of us do. But I think we need to prepare for the possibility that the Guild Council doesn't fully commit until the crisis is already underway. Then we prepare anyway, Kale said. Whether they're ready or not. He looked at Ren, at Bryce, at Seraphine, at the whole fragile, extraordinary network of people who'd built something real out of 5 months of patient, unglamorous work. We've been training for a crisis that felt distant enough to plan for carefully. I think we need to start training like it's coming significantly sooner than that. Agreed, operator. I would recommend intensifying your own drone sovereign development specifically. Tier 4 is a genuine milestone. It is not, by any historical measure I can reconstruct, sufficient for what a true containment effort would require. How far do I need to get? Further than I am currently comfortable estimating with confidence, but considerably further than where you currently stand. I am sorry, operator. I know that is not the reassurance you were hoping for. Kale looked out toward the dark western horizon, the Ashwood Deep sitting patient and unhurried exactly as it always had, and felt the shape of the coming months settle into something he understood, finally, without needing anyone to soften it for him. Then I guess we'd better get to work, he said, and hope the work goes faster than the timeline does. Chapter 80. Proof. The idea came from Tamsin, delivered with her usual flat, unsentimental practicality over a war council that had, by this point, become a near-nightly fixture at the outpost. "You want proof the council can't dismiss?" she said. "Testimony and old paperwork. They can argue with. Direct evidence from the hollow line itself. That's harder to wave away." She let that sit for a moment, watching the room's reaction settle. Nobody's gone past it and come back with a full account in living memory. I'd be lying if I said I liked this plan, but I think it's the only kind of proof that actually moves fast enough to matter. "That's not a small risk," Holden said immediately. "We don't know what's past that line. We don't know if come back with an account is even a realistic outcome." "No," Tamsin agreed. "We don't. I'm not proposing we go in blind or reckless. I'm proposing we go in prepared, with a machinist at Tier 4, a chronicler who can read whatever we find, and enough combat support to retreat the instant it stops being survivable. Controlled risk, not certain death." Kale sat with it, the weight of the decision settling heavy, and found himself, unexpectedly, thinking of his mother's journal. A woman who'd pursued a dangerous truth carefully, methodically, right up until the moment caution stopped being enough to save her. "I'll go," he said, "but only with a full plan, full escort, and Ashen's explicit agreement that the risk is survivable. I'm not doing this the way she did. I'm doing it the way she should have been allowed to." "I concur with the necessity," cautiously, Ashen said. "I would insist on several conditions. a predetermined retreat threshold agreed upon before departure, that no one, including you, operator, is permitted to argue against in the moment. Full Tier 4 Aether Reserve at the start, and Ren Cabot's residue reading actively monitoring for the specific signature we encountered at the migrated boundary, so that we have warning before we have danger, rather than after. Ren, pale but resolute, nodded immediately. I'm coming. I'm not asking permission on that one. Wasn't planning to ask you not to, Kale said. You're the only one who can actually read what we find once we get there. Seraphine and Bryce both volunteered in the same breath, and Joran and 2 additional hunters from Marrow's task force rounded out the party. 7 people, carefully chosen, carrying 5 months of hard-won trust between them into the single most dangerous expedition any of them had yet attempted. They left 3 days later, at first light, with Halden staying behind to coordinate response if anything went wrong, and Fenn seeing them off at the scrapyard gate with the particular gruff, understated worry that had become, over the months, its own familiar language. Come back, Fenn said simply, gripping Kale's shoulder with his one good hand. Whatever you find out there, come back and tell me about it yourself. I will. Is that so? Fenn's mouth did the thing that wasn't quite a smile, and he let go and stepped back. And Kale, walking through the scrapyard gate toward the dark, waiting tree line of the Ashwood Deep, carried the weight of that simple request all the way to the Hollow Line. Chapter 81. The Hollow Line. They reached it on the 3rd day. A place that didn't announce itself with any dramatic boundary marker. Simply a gradual, creeping wrongness in the forest that grew more pronounced with every mile. The spiraled bark patterns from the earlier migrated boundary, now stretching as far as Kale could see in every direction. The ambient aether density climbing so steadily that even Joran, who'd never carried more than baseline sensitivity, admitted to feeling it. Like a headache that's actually located somewhere behind your sternum instead of your skull. This is the Hollow Line, Tamsin said quietly, studying the tree line ahead. Trees that had grown, unmistakably, into something no longer entirely tree-shaped. Bark rippling in slow, deliberate patterns that made the eye want to slide away. Old maps mark it as a boundary. I don't think that's accurate anymore. I think it's a tide line, and the tide's been coming in for longer than anyone realized. Ren, palm pressed to the nearest warped trunk, went very still, the way she always did before a difficult reading. There's a pulse, she said, quiet and unsteady. Not a heartbeat, exactly. Slower. Older. But it's there, and it's, Kale, it's stronger than it was at the migrated boundary months ago. Considerably stronger. Confirmed, Ashen said, its own tone carrying a focus Kale had rarely heard from it. Recommend proceeding no further than this point for direct observation. I do not believe closer proximity offers meaningfully better evidence, and the risk curve beyond this point is not one I can model with confidence. They didn't need to go further. The proof, when it came, arrived on its own. A slow, rolling shudder through the ground beneath them. Not violent, not even especially loud, but unmistakable. And in its wake, the warped trees ahead of them parted, briefly, revealing something in the deep gloom beyond that none of them had words ready for. It wasn't a beast. It wasn't, strictly, anything Kale's communion could fully categorize. A vast, slow shape woven from root and stone, and something that might once have been countless smaller creatures merged and grown together over years of patient, dormant accumulation, easily the size of the chapel back in Ashenreach. Utterly still, utterly patient, and, Kale understood with a cold, certain lurch, not remotely finished growing. System notification. Anomaly directly observed. Deep root, partial surface manifestation. Estimated completion of current growth cycle. Months, not years. Combat contribution. Direct observation and documentation under extreme hazard conditions. Significant experience gained. Class rank reassessed. Machinist. B rank, A rank. The rank notification barely registered against the sheer, overwhelming weight of what he was actually looking at. Ren, beside him, had gone entirely white, sketching frantically in her notebook, capturing every detail her chronicler sight could hold before the warped trees slowly, patiently closed the gap again, hiding the shape from view. Retreat, Kale said, voice steady despite everything. Now, we've got what we came for. Nobody argued. They moved fast, disciplined, the same careful retreat drill they'd rehearsed a dozen times before departure. And it wasn't until they were 3 miles clear, breathing hard, adrenaline finally beginning to ebb, that Bryce finally spoke the thought sitting heavy in all of their chests. "That's what we're supposed to contain," he said, disbelieving. "That thing, however many more months it's got left to grow, that's what we're supposed to contain," Kale confirmed, and found, even through the fear, a strange, clarifying certainty settling into place alongside it. "And now we've got proof the council can't dismiss. Whatever it costs us to get this evidence back to them, it was worth it." "Agreed, operator. Though I would note, you are now A rank, significantly ahead of even my own optimistic projections. I suspect the scale of what you just witnessed accelerated more than simply the council's timeline." Kale looked back once, toward the distant, patient shape of the hollow line, and understood, with total clarity, that the story he'd been living for the past year had just, finally, stopped being something he could prepare for at a comfortable distance. Chapter 82. What the Council Could No Longer Deny. Ren's documentation. Careful sketches. Precise chronicler-verified measurements. A written account cross-referenced against every scrap of historical fragment Ashen could offer. Reached the capital 11 days later, carried personally by Halden, and escorted by a full guild detail. Marrow arranged the moment word of the expedition reached him. The council's response, when it finally came, arrived with none of the careful, deliberate hedging that had characterized every prior exchange. Full mobilization authorized, Marrow's letter read, terse with what Kale suspected was barely contained relief. Effective immediately, resources, personnel, and guild authority redirected toward coordinated deep root response. Both confirmed sites, under Joint Talent Division and Crown oversight. I will not pretend this was easy to secure, even with your evidence. But direct testimony from an A-rank machinist and a documented partial surface manifestation proved far harder to dismiss than testimony alone. You have my thanks, and my apology for how long it took to arrive. The town learned the truth within the week. Marrow's decision, finally, that the calculation Kale had turned over so many times had shifted, that a district facing genuine, imminent crisis deserved the chance to prepare, rather than remain comfortably unaware until the danger arrived at their doorstep uninvited. Nice thing this promides. The meeting filled the market square past capacity. Lanterns going up as the afternoon burned down, and Halden laid it out from the temple steps as plainly as she could. The deep root, the cycle, the containment plan, the guild's full mobilization. While Kale stood off to one side and watched 200 faces do the same math he'd been doing for months, all at once, without any of the time he'd been given to get used to the answer. Tumdian. The first voice up was Hollis Farrow, who farmed the westernmost acres in the valley, closest to the tree line, and whose question came out sounding more like an accusation. "How long have you known?" He wasn't looking at Halden. He was looking at Kale. "You, the boy from the chapel. How long have you known what's under that forest while my children slept half a mile from it?" The square went very quiet, and Kale felt the old, familiar heat of 200 eyes. The same square, near enough the same crowd, that had once laughed at a sputtering brown-gray light, and stepped forward before Halden could answer for him. "Months," he said, plainly, because he'd decided a long time ago that the truth was the only version of this he could live with. I've known for months, and I didn't say anything, because all I would have been handing you was fear, with nothing to do about it. That was a judgment call, maybe the wrong one, but I spent every one of those months building the thing that means your children can keep sleeping there. And now there's finally something you can do besides be afraid, which is why we're standing here tonight. And if your machines aren't enough, someone called from the back. If this containment fails, then it fails with every resource the Guild and the Crown can field standing behind it, Holden said, and the evacuation routes we're about to drill will already be second nature. We're not asking you to bet on one boy. We're asking you to help build the thing we all stand behind together.
The arguments went on past full dark. Evacuation versus preparation. Old grievances about guild neglect surfacing after years of quiet, old Widow Hobburn demanding, to scattered nervous laughter, whether the machines could be trusted given that at least one of them unties bootlaces. And Cale answered what he could, and admitted what he couldn't, and slowly, unevenly, the fear in the square began to change shape.
It was Father Bastian who ended it, rising near the front, the way he rose to no other occasion, and asking, in the plain, unhurried voice that had steadied 15 years of orphans and funerals and hard winters, "What can we actually do to help?" And the room's fear settled, slowly, into something steadier. Because that question, once one person had asked it out loud, turned out to be the question most of them had been waiting for permission to ask. "We train," Holden told them. "Everyone capable of holding a weapon or building a barrier. We fortify. We prepare, carefully and thoroughly, the same way this district has already been quietly preparing for months. And we trust the people who've already proven they know what they're doing." Standing at the back of the crowded square, watched his own town, the one that had once laughed at him on an awakening platform, that had thrown small deniable pranks at Bryce's boots and mourned badly named machines, and slowly, patiently, learned to trust him, turn, almost as one, toward the work ahead instead of away from it. "A remarkable thing to witness, Operator," Ashen said quietly. "I have read historical accounts of towns facing threats of this scale. Very few of them respond with anything close to this steadiness. I believe that is, in no small part, because of the year you spent quietly earning it. One small kindness, and one badly named construct at a time. I didn't do this alone." "No, you did not. That, I suspect, is precisely why it worked." Cale looked out at the square. Wren already organizing volunteers into training groups. Bryce demonstrating basic spear drills to a cluster of eager teenagers. Fenn quietly assessing which townsfolk had the steady hands for construct-assisted fortification work. And felt, underneath the enormous weight of everything still ahead, something that felt, unmistakably, like hope. "All right," he said, to no one in particular, and to everyone at once. "Let's get to work." They had, though none of them knew the number yet, 41 days. Chapter 83. Full Mobilization. Guild reinforcements began arriving within the fortnight, and Ashenreach transformed, gradually, from a quiet valley town into something closer to a proper staging ground. Training yards expanded, supply lines established, a rotating roster of hunters from 4 neighboring districts settling into Billett's dinner arranged with the same tireless, unglamorous competence he brought to everything. "Never thought I'd see the day my requisition forms actually decided the outcome of a war," Denner said, one evening, surveying a supply ledger thick enough to double as a doorstop. "Feels strange. Good strange, mostly. But strange." Cale's own role shifted with the scale of it. No longer simply training himself, but increasingly consulted on formation strategy, construct-assisted fortification design, the practical mechanics of coordinating dozens of awakeners with wildly different classes into something resembling a unified defense. It was, he found, a different kind of challenge than anything synthesis had ever demanded of him. Less about building the right construct, and more about building the right structure for people to work within. You're thinking about this the same way you think about gear ratios, Wren observed, watching him sketch a rough fortification plan across 3 separate scraps of paper one evening. Everyone's got a role. Everyone's got a tolerance. And the whole system only works if every part is actually suited to the job it's being asked to do. It's not that different, honestly. It's very different, Kale. These are people. People are just gears that occasionally disagree with the plan, Kale said, deadpan. And Wren laughed despite herself, swatting him with her notebook. Seraphine, meanwhile, had thrown herself into a role Kale hadn't fully anticipated. Liaison between the incoming guild forces and House Alcairn's own district governance, smoothing logistics and local politics with a fluency that reminded him, more than once, exactly how much capability had been sitting quietly behind her careful noble composure all along. My father's finally telling people the truth about why House Alcairns governed this district for 2 centuries, she told Kale one evening. Exhaustion and something like relief, both visible in her face. Turns out there were old family records, sealed away, that make much more sense now than they ever did before. A quiet duty nobody currently living fully understood the reason for. Passed down anyway, generation after generation, because some ancestor once decided it mattered enough to protect even without explanation. How's your father taking it? Better than I expected. Worse than I hoped. She managed a tired smile. He said something, actually, that I keep turning over. That may be the reason House Alcairns watched over this valley so carefully, for so long, without ever fully knowing why, is that some duties are worth keeping even when you've forgotten the reason, as long as you keep them with enough care, that the reason, when it finally resurfaces, finds you ready instead of caught flat-footed. Kale thought about that. About Ashen, dormant 15 years waiting for an operator who might never come. About Fenn's quiet decades of scrapyard patience. About an entire kingdom's worth of quiet, generational work finally, unexpectedly, mattering all at once. A fitting sentiment, operator, for a district about to find out exactly how ready it actually is. We're going to find out soon, aren't we? Sooner than any of us would prefer, I suspect. But yes,